I would hope that in 5 years we make up another picture of the dependencies, so that this is significantly reduced, these dependencies, and that it is reduced also in areas that are there for the future. So that, for example, what I mentioned, there are emerging areas, the widespread take-up, for example, of AI, that we have much more control over that.
Welcome to the Digital Government Podcast. Tune in to discover the future of governance and ways of getting there.
Welcome everyone to another episode of the Digital Government Podcast with your usual host, Federico Plantera, journalist, sociologist, researcher, today accompanied by a known voice of the podcast, a known voice of eGovernance Academy, which is Paul Timmers, outgoing chairman of EGA's supervisory board and visiting researcher at the University of Oxford, here to talk about today digital sovereignty and strategic autonomy, the European way. So Paul, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Federico. Pleasure to be here again.
And a pleasure also for me to address the topic that we're going to tackle today, which is an initiative called EuroStack, which basically seeks to answer or at least provide more insight, let's say, into a key question, I think, that is very current, also considering the shifts that we're seeing globally in power resources, supply chains, value chains of the tech stack globally, let's say. So the question is basically if Europe can reclaim digital sovereignty, or maybe if dependency, let's say, on foreign tech giants looms ahead. This is a topic that is not new to us. We have been talking about, and I love this thing, that we've been talking about digital sovereignty. I think the first time that we did that was maybe 2 or 3 years ago. And then basically we've had by now a series of 3 episodes on the topic of digital sovereignty, and we've always kept the pace, I would say, with the global developments that are happening, and also with your deepening research into the topic. So here you are basically you're here to unpack EuroStack. The initiative aims basically to build Europe's own digital backbone, and then it's also like a high stakes bid for technological autonomy. We're going to talk about power dynamics in this tech stack, the balance between regulation and innovation, a very high, let's say, topic, I would say, but then we will look into the folds within that. But let's start exactly by introducing EuroStack. So EuroStack, I think we can frame it as a little bit as Europe's path, let's say, to digital sovereignty. But why a stack? And where does the initiative come from? Let's talk a little bit about the genealogy of it, I would say, and also what basically led you and the other researchers who contributed to EuroStack to frame this vision as a layered, let's say, picture.
Yeah, great set of questions, Federico. And so we, as you rightly say, have been talking about digital sovereignty, or as I prefer to call it, digital strategic autonomy, since several years. And roughly the topic of strategic autonomy came into the picture in European policy, for example, very much since 2016-17. But although digital has always been stressed, it needed to get into the minds of people, and it needed to also take a shape so that people can actually almost like a picture see, aha, that's what we are talking about when you say digital sovereignty. And the stack approach, let me briefly explain what it is, but actually provides a picture, and I would recommend listeners also to definitely look up the EuroStack website, where you see a lot of attractive graphics. It's a stack of layers of the technology that starts with chips, then you get the networks, you get the Internet of Things, you get cloud, you get data and artificial intelligence on top of that, and actually at the very, very bottom of the stack, these chips are built from materials, in particular rare earth materials, or rare minerals are involved there. That's also part of the stack. And talent, of course, people. So it turns out that this visual representation of layers that are on top of each other is very helpful to communicate. That's understood by people that have a technical background, but is also understood by policymakers and people with a social sciences or political sciences background. So it communicates well, because it kind of says, we have this very important thing like AI coming up, and we want to have a say, more autonomy in AI, but that also means we may be dependent upon the cloud, and we may be dependent upon chips. So you have to think about the whole stack. Now, the genealogy of the term EuroStack, thinking in terms of a stack had been happening before, but it kind of consolidated or materialized, perhaps I should say, at a conference in September last year organized in the European Parliament, where a number of people coined the term EuroStack. I think Francesca Bria is probably the person who came first with the term. And then a number of people that saw this picture, they saw kind of the idea, they developed contributions to the whole idea of EuroStack. So there's a EuroStack pitch, for example, and there is an extensive EuroStack document that I contributed to together with Francesca Bria, Fausto Giannone, and a number of other people, commissioned by Bertelsmann Foundation and supported amongst others by CEPS and UCL's Institute. And it's called EuroStack, a European Alternative for Digital Sovereignty. And so what it does, it's not only giving the picture of the stack, but it's also doing a political economy analysis of the stack, meaning who are the players, what is the position of Europe in this, and then ultimately, as anyone can expect, it provides recommendations how to improve European digital strategic autonomy.
Okay, and then on the basis of that, as you mentioned exactly, the report. First of all, for the benefit of all our listeners, I will refer to the website that you have just mentioned, where they can find the report and more information about it, which is euro-stack.info. And aside from that, then we've addressed a little bit why a stack, but at the same time, so it looks like it's not just an initiative that aims to catch up with big tech in Europe, let's say, but instead trying to create something that is uniquely European in this field, right?
Yeah. So what you can say is, if you, on the one hand, do kind of the analysis, who is controlling the stack? That's one thing. Then you find that over 80% of Europe's digital technologies are imported. So in terms of having control over these technologies and even other consequences like, do we know how they work, and do we have enough factories or enough people that can work on it? Then Europe has a very high dependency, 80%. 70% of all AI language models are coming from the US, 20% from China, and only 5% from Europe. And these are determining technologies for the future. So you might say, does it really matter that you have that dependency? Yes, we think it does matter. That's what the report says. First of all, it's all about, of course, jobs that are created somewhere else, and it's the jobs for our children. So it's our future that we're talking about. It's also about getting unwanted rules from foreign countries that you may get. There's the risk of reduced resilience because you do not know exactly what happens in these digital critical infrastructures, and so you might get implantation of viruses or malware, and also the theft of intellectual property. And then there are these issues around the dominance of parties, that happens to be the case, and the abuse of market power. And ultimately, it's very much also about the inability to protect our democracy. So we're getting close to what Europe hopefully finds very important, having a strong democracy and protecting these values that we find as very important, because we call them actually fundamental values and rights. So it has major consequences that you don't have much to say, only 20% so to say about your digital world, because the digital world is everywhere. You need to be able to decide and act on your own future, whether economy or society or democracy. That comes back to the digital strategic autonomy that we have talked about a lot, and that you then see in the stack. And so this political economy analysis is of course about who plays a role exactly in which element of the stack. The picture is of course a bit more nuanced than 80%. We, as Europe, do have a fairly strong position, for example, in networks, but there are many other areas. Cloud is often what people are talking about. That's very much dominated by really just a handful of large cloud providers. So it's that kind of analysis of, is it, do you have a say about your future? And in the digital world, in which elements do you then need to have stronger capabilities so that you know how things work, more capacities, better capacities. Namely, you have the talented people, you have the AI factories, you have the servers, and then ultimately the real control about it, so that it is in the hands of you as Europe or like-minded countries, so that we can jointly determine the type of future that we want to have. So that's kind of like how the analysis works.
Yeah, and definitely like different layers, let's say, of this digital ecosystem that we talked about, from chips to AI, then concentrate power at different steps of the ladder. But I would say then, what in your opinion, or like as emerges actually from the report, is the biggest asymmetry, let's say, that Europe faces today in terms of this power distribution? We've mentioned the 80%, we've mentioned the reliance on like foreign technology, sometimes even on foreign rules, which is exactly what like hinders a strategic digital strategic autonomy. But then in light of this, what are some of the steps to rebalance this distribution of power resources a bit more towards European interest? In the sense, is it just a matter of public investment? Is it a matter of public-private partnerships? Like, what are we supposed to do, basically?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because beyond the analysis, you also need to be able to get to action. And perhaps one thing that is important to stress is we can do actions in all kind of elements. I will mention some in this stack, but the overall picture continues to be very important too. Are we moving into the direction of more digital sovereignty? And interestingly, and it wasn't planned like that, but when EuroStack developed, it landed precisely at the moment that the new US government took power. And they reminded us almost on a daily or weekly basis of there is a real issue here in terms of control. Likewise, China is reminding us regularly that there's a real risk if you have a dependency on China, and not to speak of Russia as a threat. So the awareness that digital sovereignty is actually really important took hold very rapidly. And so the report landed at exactly the right moment in time. And of course, we didn't plan what the US government would do, but the report was there as a reference point to say, this is really necessary that we do something. So what do you act on then? Well, the report gives a number of areas to act on. It's developing that digital stack jointly, so investing in the areas where we can have a stronger digital infrastructure. It is about developing and deploying the high impact digital services, which is very close actually also to EGA's remit, the modernization of digital public services. Then it's about fostering sovereign AI and sovereign data spaces. And there are some areas where the developments are still very much going on, but where we can take a strong role as Europe. Let's mention quantum technologies or edge computing. These are new areas, relatively new areas, where we can do a strategic investment. And ultimately, this is all, of course, not going to go for free. It's not happening just like that. And actually, it needs to be stimulated. And the EuroStack proposal says there should be a 300 billion European sovereign technology fund. So these are some of the areas that you can connect then ultimately to digital policy, or perhaps better said, it's a modern digital industrial policy. We can talk a bit more about the distinction there, but it's a different thinking about how you do digital policy or how you do industrial policy. So you cannot do everything, so you also need to set priorities. And let me then briefly repeat. These priorities are then, for example, about getting this digital infrastructure that can deliver common services, getting that right, where we don't have that bad a position in Europe. We have, for example, bases in digital identity and in digital wallet. We can definitely invest more and should invest more in AI, because that's going to be such a determining technology. And we have an opportunity in these new generation technologies like quantum technologies and edge cloud.
Yeah, because the report, exactly as you mentioned, it proposes a 300 billion euros investment in this euros, in building this EuroStack, let's say, over the next decade. And that also that makes me think about the fact that public institutions, or in any case governments or international organizations, or institutions in general, can have an active role in developing, let's say, the digital society, let's say, because often it is said, too often in my opinion, it is said that that governments are just like slowing down. They should be as slim as possible. That institutions should just like let loose, let's say, the private sector, because that's the way that tech for good can achieve something that instead governments can't. But instead, at the same time, we can see that I think also like reprising a little bit what, for example, was argued by Marianna Mazzucato in her book of in the entrepreneurial state, explaining exactly how even in the U.S. government has played a key role in enabling tech players to actually get to where they are at the moment. And instead, exactly, institutions can do something to push that, enable that, favor that. And that's exactly something that we need to address when we talk about industrial policy and modern industrial policy. Indeed, already in a past episode, we have addressed this point. We have addressed the fact that there is an intersection at the moment in current times between industrial and digital policy. And exactly, the EuroStack report argues that digital transformation without industrial policy is basically not enough. No? So let's get into that. Why is industrial policy and digital industrial policy so crucial for digital sovereignty? I would say then let's introduce also the other face of the coin, which is what is the biggest risk, let's say, if Europe fails to integrate the two things?
Very good point. Let me say upfront that EuroStack is very much based upon the assumption that the private sector and entrepreneurs will act. So it's not sitting on your hands and waiting for the European Commission to come with a proposal. No, it's acting now. It actually says hitting the ground running, because there's a lot of good stuff happening in Europe, and often it needs to get more visibility. So no wonder that fairly soon after the EuroStack was published, there was a letter by 95 companies endorsing this. I think in the meantime it's 150 companies, and saying we are behind EuroStack, we support this idea. So that's the private sector acting, and many of these are also profiling now more than ever their European solutions, and they are also reporting there's more interest for it. So that's very good. You know, there's momentum developing. At the same time, it also needs to have a policy framing, so public policy like industrial policy. Why is this different from the past, and why is it not exactly the same as the digital policy of the past or the industrial policy of the past? The reason is that a bit from a distance, what you need to develop is your capabilities and your capacities and your control. So you need to develop what you know, the talent that you have, the insights, the skills. You need to develop sufficient capacities in terms of labs, companies, fabs that can produce this digital technology, server farms, etc. And you need to make sure that you have something sufficiently to say about it, that you have control over that. And all of these elements are kind of the umbrella to say, so what can you now do with public policy? Traditionally, people would perhaps say, let's invest some money, let's stimulate research and development, and let the market do the rest. Well, that's not sufficient these days, because these days you say in this private-public partnership, we also need to make sure that governments do use what companies are developing. So public procurement is an important counterpart of it, especially when technologies are emerging. We also need to make sure that this is not protectionist. This is actually not developed by and for the European market only, but it's actually exposed to competition in the global marketplace. So international collaboration is a very important part of it. It's back-to-back international relations, and actually digital diplomacy is back-to-back good. Then there is the other point. Today, often people are complaining about it, that the internal market in Europe, which is regulated, is too complex, is fragmented. The Draghi report also talks about it. So the report also argues if we are now smart and we have a new technology that comes into place, like AI or quantum technologies to look a little bit further forward, let's clear the barriers in the internal market before they actually occur. So let's help that this internal market, which is a big asset of 400 million consumers, immediately functions well to receive the things that are developed in the context of a EuroStack or a digital autonomy initiative, whatever solutions are coming up. So you use the toolbox of instruments that policymakers have at their disposal: internal market regulation, investment, public procurement, international relations, standardization. You use them all in a coherent way so that they reinforce each other. This is quite different from traditional industrial policy, and it's also different from digital policy as we know it so far, because often digital policy takes a problem, let's take an example, cybersecurity, and tries to increase cyber resilience. But it doesn't necessarily say, at the same time, we have to make sure that this can happen to the benefit of jobs in Europe, to the benefit of control in Europe, so to the benefit of European autonomy. Even more striking example from the past is perhaps the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, of course about assuring that an important European value, the personal data protection, gets respected by means of regulation. But it didn't say anywhere, let's also have a program to stimulate good European solutions that are developed by small companies that are doing privacy enhancing technologies. So it left that all on its own. And in the end, who benefits most from it? Well, those that already had the market power. That's not the intention. So you might say it's a smarter policy.
Yeah, Giuseppe, you just mentioned exactly the thing that was going on through my mind, with the fact that I think that, we said already that basically Eurostack is not an initiative that aims for I don't know, isolationism, or like for I don't know, making Europe more I don't know, giving more strategic digital strategic autonomy to Europe, so that we can just detach and like unplug from the rest of the world, as instead I would say that some other places in the world and countries in the world with new governments are showing that they want to do, with an increasing type of like strong hand way of negotiating and, let's say, getting their way through markets, or like getting their way in what they want, also like in trade deals, deals on minerals, and like let's say the core resources that are also needed for developing exactly this tech stack of the very near future. What I would say instead, it's exactly that such kind of investment and this type of industrial policy view on digital topics also aims to increase the competitiveness, in my opinion, of Europe's own tech powerhouses. Because exactly, instead, if it's all just freeing up their, like, I think that the tech market in general and the tech sectors in general, even if, like, for how young they are, they also because they're relatively young, like the sector of like internet technologies and like contemporary digital technologies, now AI as well, they have a little bit this caveat, let's say, of all emerging economic sectors, where it's much more likely to encounter monopolies or oligopolies, let's say, within these, rather than in more established sectors that have had decades or centuries, let's say, behind them.
Yeah.
So
If I
it
may jump into that, Federico,
absolutely, absolutely.
what you are describing, for people that are interested to read some background, is very close to what Daniel Roderick describes, an international political economist, who has a very interesting short article that says economic nationalism done the right way. So, although, and essentially making the argument, let's not be naive. If you have an emerging industry in your country, let's not allow that gets immediately absorbed or killed, perhaps, by these very large powers, economic powers, large companies. Give them a chance to develop, but don't get into the trap of protectionism, because actually they become competitive and they become really good, they deliver value when they are exposed to international competition. So also make sure that ultimately they do go international. And I think that's exactly what you say, especially in the digital world, you can go international, you should go international. So it's not about protectionism, but it's also not about being so naive that you give away whatever potential you have right away in the beginning.
Yeah, you sniped the reference that I had in mind. To be fair, it was exactly Danny Roderick. because I've read a lot of his works exactly that on globalization and economic competitiveness in a globalized world, especially those that came out when internet and the internet economy, let's say, was kind of at its dawn, like in the end of the 90s, beginning of the 2000s, where we were seeing the global potential, but also the global impact and the global interconnectedness that the internet economy and a digital economy, and as a consequence, the need for a digital industrial policy as well, brought up, let's say. So, in terms of this investment, now that we've been talking about, it's clear that we're not just talking about injecting money into the economy, but achieving also something else and having some second order effects as well in that sense. So, while I would ask you also how in your opinion, for example, this public funding should be mobilized, I think we could also mention who are the stakeholders then in the EuroStack, like who stands to play a role in it and in this initiative, but at the same time, who stands to gain from it in terms of this redistribution and, after all, rebalancing of the power resources and the power players that determine, in a way, the future of Europe's strategic autonomy.
Yeah, the 300 billion European Sovereign Technology Fund that is proposed sounds like a tremendous amount of money. Although some people are saying, well, it's by far not enough because you will need a lot more to build up more digital autonomy. Well, the 300 billion is based upon, it's actually twice the amount that is mentioned in the Draghi report, but that's because the Draghi report has a span of 5 years, this has a span of 10 years, so 2 times the 150 that is mentioned in the Draghi report. And important to realize is this is not all public funding, it's actually leveraging public funding. The typical thing that we see in public funding is that it has a leverage, so a multiplier effect, unlocking private and funding from banks in general, for example. It has a multiplier effect of about a factor of 10 to 15. So the 300 billion you have to divide by 10, 30 billion. 30 billion sounds like a more manageable amount of investment, for example, at European level and national level, certainly when you also bring in, for example, public procurement. So definitely what is needed is, of course, that European investors and public investment steps in and says we can mobilize this amount of money. Is that going to be difficult? Yes. That's going to be difficult because the money is not just floating around in Europe. At the same time, since the EuroStack has developed, already announcements have been made by Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, to mobilize 200 billion for AI. And importantly also is that the world has moved on, has only become more dangerous, and Europe has realized we need to have more independence in defense. So we need to have more defense strategic autonomy. And a budget has been mentioned there of 800 billion. Now what we see and what we think is that EuroStack in certain aspects will also have a back-to-back with this defense investment. So the money hopefully will become available. It's not a done deal. It needs to be mobilized. There's a big leverage multiplier effect from public funding. And there's an opportunity to do activities that are dual use or that are developing in the civil domain but get also used, exploited and adapted in the defense domain, and therefore also can call upon greater funding. That also kind of shows a little bit about your question about the stakeholders. So ultimately we as citizens, hopefully, and consumers, we are stakeholders because we want to have more say about our future. This is democracy. We elect governments that will defend our rights, and we expect them to create a future for our children, a future in which they are not dependent only on foreign decision makers that may not have the best intentions with us, as you are kind of hinting at. Now, that means although citizens are the ultimate beneficiaries and companies and employees are the ultimate beneficiaries, there is a big role for governments to play, European institutions, because they can help to give the overall framing, and they in certain areas are starting to do that, like investment in AI, for example, and there will be more happening in the field of quantum, for example. National governments, because they are buying, they are big procurers, they buy a lot of digital stuff, and they need to think about it. When they do buy cloud, which cloud are they going to buy? So they need to develop a strategy. How do we square our sovereignty with cloud purchasing as an important factor? And our sovereignty is really, our strategic autonomy. What do we buy? Then companies are major stakeholders. I mentioned already 150 companies have sent a letter of support. And the whole approach of EuroStack is to say, we do not necessarily need to have this concentrated in a few oligopolistic big tech, European big tech firms. No, this can actually be also federation of many contributions that are coming, for example, from the open source community. Data federation has typically that aspect. We have a very strong open source development in many of the cloud facilities also in Europe, and value added services to cloud, also in Internet of Things, for example. So we also call upon open source communities to be active, and I know they are also now putting forward solutions from the open source community that are EuroStack labeled. Now, that means quite a number of parties have to be on board. That doesn't make it easier, We are not a top-down diktat, so to say. We are collaborative. It doesn't make it easier, but it fits, I think, very much with the spirit of collaboration in Europe. And this is one of the assets I think that often people are forgetting. Whatever you think about Europe, European collaboration has established a practice that pretty easily companies and universities and authorities across Europe, they sit together, they work together, they know how to collaborate.
And I think that that's exactly one of the things that instead we see are being tested, let's say, by means of other ways of negotiating and getting things out of other countries and people, let's say, exactly in this current geopolitical context. I will add one thing to what you mentioned regarding the spending and like where does the money come from and for what, and the fact that in the meantime we've also realized that exactly in Europe we need further investments into defense. And in that sense, I see, for example, some kind of connection or mirroring in what you said with, for example, a proposal that was put forward by Spain in order of how to utilize all the budget and all the spending that is set to happen in the next years for defense, by implying that defense and strategic autonomy is not just pom pom and missiles, but it is also exactly gaining strategic autonomy in other fields such as making the electricity and energy grids more efficient, as we saw that also, for example, we do need to do, given what happened in spring in Spain, exactly with the 24-hour blackout, but also a number of other topics that do feed into the topic of gaining the strategic autonomy and sheltering ourselves from a number of dangers and risks, let's say. I would close this episode now with one question that actually picks up on something that you mentioned before, which was, for example, the GDPR or the fact that Europe in general, I would say that like Europe's biggest contributions to the tech policy fields are often regarded as being regulations, no? For example, like the GDPR or the AI Act that we were talking about last year as well, and then now I think is also like under review or like in discussion in some points at the European level. Something then that I would ask about that is these are tech initiatives that have come from Europe, and definitely they have been regarded as successful to a certain extent, in the sense that they have managed to set some global standards in terms of regulations that then have been adopted or have inspired, let's say, regulation in other countries. But instead, with the view of EuroStack, and from the point of view of EuroStack, what will be the biggest test, let's say, for this European tech stack in the next years? Meaning, if we fast forward by 5 years, let's not even go that far, 5 years, what would success for this digital initiative look like in your opinion?
Yeah, I would hope that in 5 years we make up another picture of the dependencies, so that this is significantly reduced, these dependencies, and that it is reduced also in areas that are there for the future. So that, for example, what I mentioned are emerging areas, the widespread take-up, for example, of AI, that we have much more control over that. the position of Europe in edge cloud and in quantum and Internet of Things, that has all improved. So this we could measure and say, but we didn't say in EuroStack it has to be going from 80% dependency to say 40% dependency. But I think this is something that in individual policy areas people could take into account. So take public procurement. How much dependency do you now have? How much dependency will you have in 5 years? At the same time, I think we also should not be naive. Don't expect that in 5 years from now there will be zero dependency, let alone that I already said it's not beneficial, it's not feasible, and it's not desirable if we don't have any foreign dependencies, because it's the international trade, it's specialization, it's the global marketplace where we also want to benefit from. Beyond that point, I think we need to have this kind of more strategic outlook, because it seemed to kind of have happened to us, you know. We became gradually ever more dependent. What happened? Were we kind of sitting on our hands, sleeping, naive? No. In 5 years from now, I hope that there is a firmly established practice to always think about your sovereignty when you are taking important decisions. So when you do your important projects and policies, I would say do a strategic autonomy test, a check. A simple one, not complicated, but think about it. Do I now increase my knowledge? Do I now increase my capacity? Do I now have more people who have the talent and the skills to use or develop these new technologies? Do I have a minority or majority stake in the companies that are determining our digital future? So that we do this kind of test systematically. And actually, isn't it kind of strange that we don't do that? And I hope in 5 years from now we look back and say, we never did that. Well, now it's a common practice.
And for more information about EuroStack as an initiative and to download the report, which I recommend everybody to check out, I did, and it's very nice and very insightful and very interesting. You should just head to euro-stack.info. And Paul Timmers, thanks a lot for joining me today.
Thank you very much, Federico. It was a pleasure.
It was a pleasure for me too. I love talking about these topics. We know that already by now. And I hope we will get to do it again in the next month, or maybe in a year time. We have this spring appointment basically by now. So
absolutely. We continue.
That's what will happen again. Yes. Thanks to everybody also who tuned in to this podcast episode. That's it also from your host for today. And make sure to tune in to the next one. And that's where I will see you. Have a good day.
This podcast is brought to you by the eGovernance Academy. Tune in next time.